All right, so today we're going to kind of jump into the middle of things.
Okay.
And one of the things that is so striking right off the bat is that these really unsettling episodes didn't just go away
Right.
when she moved.
Exactly. And, she goes on to live in Spain and in the UK. And throughout all of this, these disturbing experiences are persisting despite the change of scenery.
Yeah.
So it really begs the question,
Yeah.
is this something, internal? Is it psychological?
Right.
Or is there truly something external at play here?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And it kind of makes you think about,
Right.
times in our own lives where we've maybe questioned the same thing. And it's so interesting how openly the author admits that she was reluctant to kind of look inward.
Yeah.
She says it was easier to believe in an entity.
It's easier to blame something outside of yourself.
Yeah, it's almost as if facing like an external monster
Yeah.
was preferable to confronting, something
Right.
within.
Right.
So what do you think that tells us about how we as humans sometimes deal with these really intense feelings of fear or distress?
Well, I think it really speaks to this very human tendency that when we are faced with overwhelming internal experiences, right?
Yeah.
Whether that be fear, anxiety,
Mm-hmm.
even joy sometimes,
Right.
our minds will often try to find an external source to attribute that to.
Right.
It's a way of trying to gain a sense of control in a situation where we feel very out of control.
That makes sense.
And it's also, it's a way of sort of making the intangible tangible,
Right.
naming the nameless fear,
Yeah. Yeah, and living in that constant state of high alert and that persistent stress, it inevitably takes a physical toll.
Of course.
The author is really clear on this. She
Yeah.
says, this amount of continued stress can't go on without taking a huge toll on physical well-being.
Right.
So what is the sort of underlying mechanism there?
Well, our bodies are remarkably adept at maintaining equilibrium,
Right. Yeah.
but they're not really designed for a sustained state of fight or flight.
Right.
When we experience negative emotions chronically,
Yeah.
it triggers a physiological cascade,
Right.
essentially a chain reaction
Yeah.
of physical changes in the body,
Oh, wow.
triggered by, these stress hormones like cortisol and adrenaline.
Right.
So this prolonged stress can really manifest in a variety of ways,
Yeah.
as the body is constantly trying to cope with this really heightened sense of alertness.
So how did the author attempt to manage these kind of growing symptoms?
Yeah, well, she does talk about using medication
Right.
as a way to kind of address the immediate discomfort. But what's also really crucial here is that she openly acknowledges that she really avoided seeking professional psychological support.
It's interesting.
There's a sense of shame,
Yeah.
an unwillingness to confront her own, quote unquote, wrongdoings,
Right.
to really delve into that inner turmoil.
And it really just underscores how much stigma there is around
Absolutely.
mental health.
Yeah.
It's like,
It can feel like such a weakness.
yeah, like you're failing in some way
Exactly.
if you need to seek support. And it can be a huge hurdle
Huge hurdle.
for people.
Yep.
But then there's this fascinating,
Yes.
almost ironic turn of events.
Right.
Tell us about her move to the UK in 2013.
So she moves to the UK and she begins working in the neurology department
Wow.
at the University of Oxford.
Of all places.
Right.
It's unbelievable.
Surrounded by leading experts in the very fields that are so central to her own experiences.
Wow.
The mind, sleep, physiological issues.
Right.
It's like she's in the epicenter of potential answers.
Right.
It's amazing, isn't it?
It really is.
And she even acknowledges this.
Be done.
She says it was as if this job was preparing me to be ready for a solution.
Yeah.
But, imagine working alongside the top researchers in sleep while personally averaging only 2 to 3 hours of sleep a night
Right.
and dreading the very act of dreaming.
Yeah. And I think, one question that comes to mind is working so closely with these experts
Right.
in sleep and the mind.
Yeah.
Did she gain any sort of theoretical understanding
Yeah.
of what she was going through?
Even if she couldn't apply it to herself yet.
Exactly, because, she was exposed to all this cutting-edge research
Right.
on sleep disorders, on the neurological underpinnings of anxiety and stress,
Yeah.
and the connection between the mind and the body.
Right.
But there's a big gap between, having that intellectual knowledge
For sure.
and actually having that lived experience.
Absolutely.
And as she says, I wasn't ready yet.
Right.
Life wasn't hurting enough.
Right.
And I think sometimes it takes that, that level of internal pressure
Right.
before we're willing to truly confront our deepest struggles.
And I think it brings us to a point that a lot of listeners are probably wondering about right now.
Yeah, what are the root causes here?
Yeah.
Right?
Was there a trauma?
Was there something that kickstarted all of this?
Right.
Yeah.
Was he cheating on her?
Yeah.
Did she have, trouble somewhere else?
Exactly. What is it that kind of set her on this path?
Right. And the answer, as she came to understand it,
Mm-hmm.
points inward.
Yeah, she really identifies these self-destructive tendencies
Yeah.
that were caused by this inner battle
Right.
between her expectations
Right.
and what others expected from her.
Yeah. So it's that feeling of being pulled in different directions.
Absolutely, this inner turmoil,
Right.
this clash between her authentic self
Yeah.
and the weight of external expectations.
Mm-hmm.
And that really seems to have created this fertile ground
Yeah.
for all of these struggles to really surface.
And it's important to note that, later on she did recognize that the roots of these self-destructive tendencies actually lay in earlier traumas
That's right.
that were very deeply buried.
Yeah, we can carry these things with us
Right.
for years sometimes without even realizing it.
Yeah, absolutely. And it wasn't an isolated issue, was it?
No.
She lists this whole confluence of contributing factors.
Very perfect storm.
Yeah,
Right.
a real perfect storm of emotional stressors.
Yeah.
She talks about feeling like a victim, blaming others.
Living in unwanted places.
Yeah.
Unhappiness in her relationship, not pursuing her dreams.
And then a really significant family trauma
Yes, in the UK.
in the UK.
That really sort of tips the scales.
Yeah, and it paints a picture of a life that's increasingly, out of sync with her inner self.
Absolutely. She's living a life that on the surface may seem,
Right.
Enviable to some.
Yes, and that's the thing that really gets me is she talks about this guilt.
Yeah.
This feeling of guilt that she
Yeah.
had because outwardly she seemed to have it all.
She had the partner, she was traveling, she had interesting work.
Freedom.
Freedom.
But she was miserable.
And that disconnect,
Yeah.
right, between the external presentation and the internal reality.
It can be so isolating.
So isolating.
And she felt like she couldn't really share
Right.
her true feelings.
Who would believe her?
Yeah. She says on paper, I was supposed to be happy.
Exactly. And I think so many of us can relate to that feeling
Yes.
of, needing to present a certain image to the world,
Right.
even when we're struggling.
Right. And then comes this family trauma that she mentions.
Yeah.
This phone call from her father.
Out of the blue.
Yeah, announcing that he's divorcing her mother.
Right.
And this feels like a real turning point
It does.
in her story.
Yeah.
A catalyst that just really sends things spiraling.
It intensifies everything.
Yeah. And she and her sister immediately go back home.
Right. To try and, make sense of it all.
And she talks about the toxicity that they witnessed.
Yeah, between her parents.
Yeah. And so for someone who's already in this state of, emotional instability,
Right.
to then witness.
The breakdown of her family.
Yes.
It's profoundly destabilizing.
Yeah.
It really underscores how interconnected our well-being is with our family dynamics.
And it wasn't just the divorce itself. It was the impact that it had on her mother.
Oh, absolutely.
The depression
Right.
that her mother fell into.
The suicidal thoughts.
And she very clearly states that this event, coupled with, her own internal state, created the perfect fertile ground
Yeah.
for her own descent into depression.
Right. It's like a vulnerability that's already there.
Right.
And then this just cracks it wide open.
And she really poignantly says, nothing prepares you for depression.
It's true.
It is a silent killer.
Yeah.
And it makes me think, she was working in this neurology department
Right.
at Oxford.
Surrounded by experts.
She had all of this knowledge.
Yes.
Right.
But it's theoretical knowledge.
Right.
It's not the lived experience.
And it wasn't enough to equip her
No.
to deal with what was going on.
Right. It's a powerful reminder
Yeah.
that, sometimes intellectual knowledge
Right.
just doesn't translate into the ability to cope.
Especially in the moment.
In those really intense emotional moments,
Yeah.
sometimes we just don't have the tools,
Right.
even if we understand the concepts.
So as we sort of bring this deep dive to a close,
Yeah.
we've followed the author through these escalating struggles with sleep disturbances, this persistent internal conflict,
Right.
the really significant physical and emotional toll that all of this took on her.
The toll it took on her body and her mind.
This ironic setting of, working in neurology at Oxford
Of all places, right?
while going through all of this.
Yeah.
And then the profound impact of that family trauma
Right.
that ultimately contributed to her depression.
Yeah, and what strikes me is just how complex the human mind really is.
Oh, absolutely.
The way that our external circumstances
Yeah.
can become so deeply intertwined with our internal psychological processes.
It's fascinating.
It is, and sometimes it's in these really unexpected ways.
Yeah.
But, I'd like to kind of leave our listeners with a question. What resonated with you the most about the author's story?
Yeah.
Um, Particularly that initial reluctance to take responsibility
Right.
for her own struggles, and how might external pressures, be contributing to similar internal conflicts in your own life?
It really makes you think about, the power of acknowledging our own truth.
Absolutely.
No matter how difficult it might be, it's
Yeah.
a first step
Sometimes it's the hardest step,
to getting better.
but it can be the most important.
And we're really looking forward to continuing this deep dive into the author's journey of recovery
I am too.
and exploring the insights and the wisdom that she gained along the way.
Absolutely. There's so much more to uncover.
So stay tuned for our next conversation
We'll see you then.
as we delve further into how she found a path forward.
A path to healing.
Yeah.